The woman collapsed at the gate like a broken bird falling from the sky. Blood dripped from her split lip onto the dusty gravel of the Iron Wolves' compound, and her breath came in ragged gasps that spoke of miles run on empty lungs. She was perhaps 40 years old, though the bruises made it hard to tell. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare and bleeding, and her eyes held the wild terror of something hunted. Marcus "Bear" Thompson was the first to see her. He had been wiping down his Harley when the shadow stumbled into his peripheral vision, and for a moment he thought it was just another stray dog looking for scraps. Then he heard the sound of a human being who had reached the absolute end of hope. The compound fell silent. 15 bikers stopped what they were doing and turned toward the gate. In 20 years of riding with the Iron Wolves, Bear had seen many things stumble onto their property. Cops, rivals, journalists with death wishes, but never anything like this. The woman lifted her head and her eyes found Bear's. In that single moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. The recognition of one survivor to another. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a whisper emerged, a single word that would set into motion a chain of events none of them could have predicted. The word was a name, and that name belonged to one of the most powerful men in the state. Bear's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Everyone in the underground knew that name. It belonged to a man who made people disappear, a man whose reach extended into every shadow of their world. The woman had just brought war to their doorstep. The president of the Iron Wolves was a man named Daniel Kane, though no one had called him Daniel in 30 years. To the world, he was simply Reaper, a name earned in circumstances he never discussed. At 58, his beard had gone silver and his knuckles carried the scars of 100 fights, but his eyes remained sharp as broken glass. Reaper emerged from the clubhouse as Bear carried the woman inside. He watched in silence as they laid her on the worn leather couch, as the brothers gathered around like wolves circling wounded prey. But these wolves were not hungry. These wolves were curious, concerned. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of sentences that painted a picture none of them wanted to see. She spoke of a house on a hill, of locked doors and guarded windows, of years spent in a prison without bars. She spoke of escape, of running through darkness, of a man who would never stop looking. Reaper listened to every word. When she finally fell into exhausted sleep, he gestured for the inner circle to follow him outside. 5 men gathered under the flickering porchlight, their faces grim. The name she had whispered belonged to Victor Ashford, a real estate developer whose legitimate businesses were merely the tip of a very dark iceberg. Ashford had connections in City Hall, in the police department, in places that made the Iron Wolves look like a children's club. Taking this woman in meant making an enemy of a man who had buried better men than them. It meant risking everything they had built over 3 decades. It meant potential war. Reaper looked at his brothers, at the men who had bled beside him countless times. The decision was unanimous. They would not turn her away. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she had been invisible for 7 years. Not missing, because missing implies someone is looking. Sarah had simply ceased to exist in any way that mattered. Her family believed she had moved abroad. Her friends had stopped calling years ago. The world had moved on without her, as worlds tend to do. Victor Ashford had found her when she was at her lowest point. Homeless, hungry, desperate for any kindness in a city that had shown her none. He had offered her a warm bed and a hot meal, and she had accepted because survival demands compromise. What she could not have known was that accepting his offer meant signing away her freedom. The house on the hill was beautiful from the outside. Tall windows, manicured gardens, the kind of elegance that appeared in magazines. Inside, it was a prison designed for one. The doors locked from the outside. The windows were reinforced glass. The staff answered only to him. Sarah learned quickly that Victor collected things: art, cars, antiques, and people. She was simply another acquisition, a living ornament to be displayed when convenient and stored when not. The first time she tried to escape, she made it half a mile before his men found her. After that, she stopped trying. But 3 nights ago, something changed. Victor had a business meeting that required all hands on deck. For the first time in 7 years, Sarah saw an unlocked door and an empty hallway. She ran without thinking, without planning, wearing only what she had on. She ran until her feet bled and her lungs burned, and her body simply could not carry her any further. She ran until she found a gate with iron wolves painted on its surface. The iron wolves were not heroes. They knew this about themselves and made no apologies for it. They had done things that would make decent people recoil in horror. They had broken laws, broken bones, broken promises to people who trusted them. They were outlaws in the truest sense of the word, living outside the boundaries that contained ordinary citizens. But they had a code. And that code, forged in blood and brotherhood over 3 decades, contained one principle that superseded all others. The Iron Wolves did not abandon the vulnerable. It was the first rule every prospect learned, the one law that could never be broken. The rule existed because of a woman named Maria. She had been Reaper's mother, a Mexican immigrant who had cleaned houses and raised 3 sons on her own after their father disappeared. When Reaper was 14, a landlord had tried to force himself on Maria in exchange for reduced rent. Young Daniel Kane had beaten the man so badly he spent 3 months in the hospital. It was his first act of violence. It would not be his last. But it had taught him something that shaped everything that came after. Some people needed protection, and those with the power to protect had the responsibility to do so. Now, 44 years later, Reaper sat beside Sarah's sleeping form and watched her breathe. She reminded him of his mother in those early years, that same mixture of exhaustion and resilience, that same determination to survive despite impossible odds. Victor Ashford had money, power, and connections. The Iron Wolves had none of those things. What they had was loyalty, ferocity, and a willingness to die for each other. Reaper hoped it would be enough. Victor Ashford learned of Sarah's location within 48 hours. He had contacts everywhere, eyes in every shadow, and the Iron Wolves compound was hardly a secret. When his informant called with the news, Victor felt something he rarely experienced: genuine anger. She had been his for 7 years, his to display, his to control, his to possess. The idea that she had not only escaped, but found protection with a group of motorcycle-riding degenerates was an insult he could not tolerate. Victor Ashford was a man who took insults very personally. His first instinct was to send his people in force. 12 men with weapons could overwhelm any biker gang. But Victor had not become powerful by acting on instinct. He had become powerful by thinking several moves ahead. A direct assault would create witnesses, evidence, complications. The Iron Wolves, for all their criminal activities, had surprisingly clean records in recent years. No outstanding warrants, no pending cases, nothing that would allow law enforcement to look the other way during a raid. Victor would need to be smarter. He would need to isolate Sarah, separate her from her protectors, make her choose to come back. He had done it before with others who had attempted escape. The method was simple: threaten the people they cared about until compliance seemed like the only option. The problem was that Sarah had cared about no one for 7 years. He had made sure of that, cutting her off from family and friends until he was her entire world. Now she had found new people to care about, and that gave Victor new leverage. He smiled as he reached for his phone. The Iron Wolves thought they were protecting Sarah. They did not realize they had just made themselves her weakness. The first warning came 3 days later. Bear's sister lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, a quiet life with 2 children and a husband who worked at the factory. She woke one morning to find photographs on her doorstep. Photographs of her children at school, at the park, walking home alone. No note accompanied the images. None was necessary. Bear's reaction was exactly what Victor had anticipated: rage, fear, and a desperate need to protect his family. He wanted to ride to Ashford's mansion and burn it to the ground. It took 3 brothers to hold him back, to make him understand that violence was precisely what their enemy wanted. Reaper called an emergency meeting. The inner circle gathered around the scarred wooden table that had witnessed 3 decades of decisions, and they faced the reality of their situation. Victor Ashford was sending a message. No one connected to the Iron Wolves was safe as long as they harbored Sarah. The obvious solution was also the unthinkable one. They could simply give her back. She was just one woman, a stranger who had stumbled into their lives by accident. Was she worth risking their families, their livelihoods, everything they had built? Sarah appeared in the doorway during the discussion. She had heard everything through the thin walls of the clubhouse. Her eyes moved from face to face, seeing the conflict, understanding the impossible position she had put them in. She spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice steady despite her terror. The room fell silent as she offered the only solution she could imagine. She would leave. She would turn herself in. She would go back to that house on the hill and spend the rest of her life there. Reaper's response to Sarah's offer was immediate and absolute. He stood from his chair, crossed the room, and did something that shocked everyone present, including himself. He took Sarah's hands in his scarred ones and spoke directly to her eyes. His voice carried 30 years of authority, the weight of a man who had led others through hell and brought them out the other side. He told her that the Iron Wolves did not negotiate with terrorists. He told her that the moment she stepped onto their property, she became one of them. He told her that abandoning family was not something they did. Sarah began to cry. Not the desperate tears of fear she had shed upon arrival, but something different, something cleaner, the tears of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be valued. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Whatever doubts had existed dissolved in the face of Reaper's conviction. The Iron Wolves would not surrender. They would not run. They would stand and fight, as they had always done, for one of their own. The next hours were spent in preparation. Phone calls were made, favors were called in, alliances were strengthened. The Iron Wolves were not alone in the world. They had brothers in other chapters, connections in other cities, relationships built over decades of mutual respect. By midnight, the compound had transformed. 20 additional bikers had arrived from neighboring territories. Security protocols had been established. Children and vulnerable family members had been moved to safe locations. Victor Ashford wanted war. He was about to discover that the people he had dismissed as degenerates were more organized, more loyal, and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The wolves were circling. Victor made his move on the 4th night. He had expected the Iron Wolves to fold under pressure, to sacrifice one woman for the safety of their families. Their resistance was an inconvenience he had not anticipated, but inconveniences could be overcome. 12 men in black vehicles approached the compound at 3 in the morning. They were professionals, former military and private security, men who had done this type of work before. Victor had paid them handsomely and promised them more upon completion. Their instructions were simple: retrieve the woman, eliminate anyone who interfered. What they found was not a sleeping compound of unprepared bikers. What they found was a fortress. The first vehicle triggered a hidden sensor 200 yards from the gate. Floodlights illuminated the entire perimeter, turning night into day. Armed figures appeared on rooftops, behind barricades, in positions that covered every angle of approach. The lead vehicle stopped. The driver assessed the situation with professional detachment and reached the only logical conclusion. This was not a raid. It would be a massacre. Not of the bikers, but of his own team. He made a call to Victor, explaining that the situation had changed. The Iron Wolves were prepared, reinforced, and displayed military-level coordination. Continuing the assault would result in significant casualties with no guarantee of success. Victor's response was predictable: complete the mission at any cost. But the driver was not a fanatic. He was a professional who valued his life and the lives of his men. He ended the call, ordered his vehicles to withdraw, and drove away into the darkness. Back in his mansion, Victor Ashford threw his phone against the wall. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: uncertainty. The failed assault changed the dynamics of the conflict. Victor Ashford had revealed his hand, demonstrated his willingness to use violence, and failed to achieve his objective. In the world of power and perception, failure was fatal. Word spread through channels that existed beneath the surface of polite society. The whisper network of criminals, outcasts, and survivors carried the story of the Iron Wolves' stand. A homeless woman had asked for help. A biker gang had provided it. A powerful man had tried to crush them and failed. More support arrived at the compound. Not just bikers now, but others who had their own reasons to oppose men like Victor Ashford. Former victims who had escaped similar situations. Activists who had been fighting trafficking for years. Lawyers who specialized in cases no one else would touch. Sarah watched this gathering with something she had forgotten how to feel: hope. For 7 years, she had believed she was completely alone, that no one would ever help her, that her fate was sealed. Now she stood in the center of a movement that had formed around her survival. The lawyers were particularly valuable. They explained to Sarah that her testimony, combined with evidence they could help her gather, might be enough to bring Victor Ashford down, not just for what he had done to her, but for others. Sarah was not his only victim. She was simply the one who had escaped. The prospect was terrifying. Testifying meant making herself visible, putting her face and name on the record, becoming a target not just of Victor, but of his entire network. It meant giving up any hope of quietly disappearing. Sarah thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she made her decision. Victor Ashford had spent decades building an empire of shadow and silence. He had cultivated relationships with judges, politicians, and law enforcement officers. He had buried evidence, eliminated witnesses, and constructed a persona of legitimate success that concealed the monster beneath. All of it began to crumble when Sarah Mitchell walked into the FBI field office, flanked by Iron Wolves members who had volunteered to serve as her protection detail. The lawyers had done their work well. Sarah's testimony was recorded, documented, and corroborated with physical evidence that the legal team had assembled. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Other women came forward once they learned they were not alone. Former employees provided testimony about what they had witnessed. Financial records revealed patterns that could not be explained by legitimate business. Victor watched the walls closing in with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had destroyed people who threatened him before. He had always found a way, but this time was different. This time, the threat did not come from a single point he could eliminate. It came from everywhere at once. His lawyers advised him to negotiate a plea deal. His accountants advised him to move assets offshore while he still could. His security team advised him to disappear. Victor did none of these things. Instead, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He decided to handle the problem personally. The way he had handled problems before his wealth gave him the luxury of hired hands. On a cold Tuesday evening, Victor Ashford loaded a weapon, climbed into his car, and drove toward the Iron Wolves compound. If the system would not give him Sarah, he would take her himself. The compound was quiet when Victor arrived. Most of the reinforcements had returned home after the failed assault, believing the immediate danger had passed. Only the core members remained, along with Sarah and a skeleton security crew. Victor had planned his approach carefully. He parked a mile away and continued on foot, using the darkness and his knowledge of the property's layout, information purchased from a former prospect who had been expelled years earlier. He found Sarah alone on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, staring at stars she had not been allowed to see for 7 years. She did not hear him approach until he was already behind her, his weapon pressed against her spine. His voice was soft, almost tender, as he told her it was time to come home. He promised that he would forgive her transgressions if she came willingly. He promised that things would be different, better, the way they had been in the beginning. Sarah listened to his promises with the clarity of someone who had finally escaped a burning building. She understood now what she had not understood before. Victor did not love her. Victor did not love anyone. Victor was incapable of the emotion. She was simply a possession he refused to lose. She did not scream or run. Instead, she turned slowly to face him, looking into his eyes for the first time without fear. She told him something she had waited 7 years to say. 3 simple words that carried the weight of her entire captivity. The words made Victor hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, shadows moved in the darkness around them. He was not as alone as he had believed. The Iron Wolves had known Victor would come. They had been counting on it. The reduced security, the seemingly unprotected compound, Sarah's solitary presence on the porch, all of it was calculated to draw out a man whose pride would not allow him to accept defeat. Bear emerged first from the shadows, his massive frame blocking any escape route. Then came the others, materializing from darkness like ghosts. Within seconds, Victor Ashford was surrounded by men who had waited patiently for this moment. Reaper stepped forward, his silver beard catching moonlight, his eyes holding something that made Victor's blood run cold. There was no rage in those eyes, only certainty. Victor tried to raise his weapon, but his hand was empty. He had not even felt Bear remove it from his grip. For the first time in decades, Victor Ashford was completely powerless. The police arrived 20 minutes later, responding to an anonymous call about a trespasser with a weapon. They found Victor Ashford seated on the ground, hands zip-tied behind his back, surrounded by bikers who claimed they had detained him in self-defense. The weapon was registered in Victor's name. His presence on private property was undeniable. His previous threats were documented. Combined with the ongoing federal investigation, the situation gave prosecutors everything they needed. Victor Ashford was arrested that night. He would spend the next 18 months fighting legal battles he could not win, watching his empire disintegrate, seeing his connections abandon him one by one. Sarah Mitchell watched them load him into the police car. She felt many things in that moment: relief, exhaustion, grief for the years she had lost. But mostly, she felt something she had not felt in 7 years. She felt free. 3 years passed. Victor Ashford was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars, alone and forgotten. The empire he had built, distributed among lawyers, creditors, and the state. Sarah Mitchell remained with the Iron Wolves, not as a dependent or a victim, but as family. She learned to ride, earned her own leather, and discovered skills she never knew she possessed. The compound that had been her refuge became her home. She also became something else, an advocate. Working with the lawyers who had helped free her, Sarah established a network for others escaping situations like her own. The Iron Wolves served as protection, as transport, as the muscle that made rescue possible when official channels failed. In 4 years, they helped 43 people escape captivity, 43 lives saved by a group of outlaws who lived by a code most law-abiding citizens would never understand. Reaper watched it all with quiet pride. The decision to protect one desperate woman had transformed his club. given them a purpose beyond survival, connected them to something larger than themselves. The Iron Wolves were still outlaws, still rough men who lived by their own rules, but they were also something more. Sarah stood beside him on the anniversary of her arrival, watching the sun set over the compound that had changed her life. She thought about all she had lost. 7 years of freedom, connections with family and friends, the person she might have become without Victor's shadow. But she also thought about what she had gained. A family that would never abandon her. A purpose that gave meaning to her suffering, and a future she had never dared to imagine. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places.